It's Dark Academia Day. Hi, welcome. My name is Callie and I talk about books and writing. Today we're going to talk about my favorite Dark Academia books. I'm a little annoyed that the weather isn't cooperating and we are having the sunniest, cheeriest September day. And there's not really a good place for me to film in which I get that Dark Academia vibe, what I would give for a thunderstorm right now. But in this video, I'm going to talk about a few different books. I'm first going to start with the one Dark Academia book that is on my TBR, and then 3 new Dark Academia books that I read this year for the first time. And then lastly, I think there's 9 of my solid favorites, maybe 10. I didn't count the stack very well. Before I start, I am going to say I am currently watching season 3 of Discovery of Witches, and if you need a Dark Academia fix, that series is fantastic. Netflix just picked it up. It used to be on AMC Plus or something like that, and I was waiting till I had a 7-day period where I felt like I could do the free trial and just watch the entire season of the 3rd season. And now it's on Netflix. I don't have to because we subscribe to Netflix, and I'm just enjoying it so thoroughly. I love that show. I never read the books. I started the first book of Discovery of Witches a year ago or 2 years ago, and I really enjoyed the writing, but I sat and read for about 30 minutes and realized I had read 8 pages because it was very dense, and I'm like, I don't think I have the patience for this because it's quite a long book. But I've really enjoyed getting to experience the story through the show. Also, I think that Diana's outfits is going to be my new fashion template that I'd like to work off of. Her outfits are fantastic. They're amazing. And they're very I'm in my 30s or 40s and working in a library that's kind of chilly, which is very much where I want to be in my life right now. Okay, so the first book we're going to talk about is The Lost Elemental by Tessa Hale. I started it, I'm on page 28, and I put it down because then I read a review about it and decided it wasn't what I wanted to read just then, but I'll get back to it at some point. It's not really like our world because magic exists and everyone knows about it. And at the beginning, our main character goes to this auditorium in which everyone gets tested to see if they have magic. She's convinced she doesn't have any magic, but then she has a ton of magic. So she's gonna go to this magical school that's called Kingwood Academy, which I haven't gotten there yet in the book, and explore her magic in a magical setting. The reason I paused this and didn't continue it is because it is a why choose romance, which is also called reverse harem, which isn't usually my cup of tea. I am very much you have one person that you fall in love with and that's your person forever. But every once in a while I'm okay with a triad. So I will eventually go back to this and continue it because I did like the beginning. It was very exciting. So this year I read 3 Dark Academia books throughout the year, not all in the last week or whatever. And the one I read first was Ink Blood Sister Scribe by Emma Torres. This does not take place in a school, but it is so thoroughly involved in books and then also artifacts that it felt very Dark Academia to me. It's about 2 sisters who have magic, and one has to never stop moving and one has to guard their childhood home. And then there's also this other person who's a young man who they are connected to, and the 3 of them together have this sort of, I don't want to call it a quest because it's not really a quest, mission they have to complete. What I liked about this book is it really leaned into books as magic, which was really cool, and the way the author utilizes books and blood as a way for magic to exist was really interesting. My favorite sister is the one who has to travel constantly because when we open the book, she's in Antarctica, and that was just really cool. Antarctica is a place that I have probably an irrational fear of because I'll never go there, but it was a great setting to be kind of trapped in. Next, I read Return to Wildcliff Heights by Carol Goodman. I love Carol Goodman. There'll be some more on this list of my old favorites. This one also does not take place in a school, but it takes place in a really gothic manor called Wildcliff Heights, and it's about writing and a reclusive writer who was blinded in a fire and is now finally gonna complete her story, which feels very Dark Academia. There's also quite a bit about publishing in here and uncovering secret parts of history that are kind of lost in the past. And then I also read The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark, and I just read this in August. And this is about a boarding school in the 1930s in England, and the girls who are following are like 11 to 14, I think, and they're kind of obsessed with their teacher, Miss Jean Brodie, who like is kind of inappropriate with them, like the way she talks. She tells them like wild stories, and you don't think there's like very much teaching going on, but they also kind of like make up stories in their mind about what they think of her. And then at the same time, the administration is trying to kind of push her out because they don't think that she's like teaching correct material to the girls. And it was fun and funny and like a really, really fast read. As soon as I finished that, I realized that two of the books I already have in my old favorites, I actually read last January, but they already just feel so like cemented in my mind as old favorites. So let's start with those. They are, of course, Divine Rivals and Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. I don't read YA very often, and when I do, I'm usually let down. Let me tell you, fantastic. The reason I'm counting these as dark academia is while they're not a school setting, I do think the like journalistic part of it, all the writing and the magical typewriter, and very much like the vibe of the books felt very dark academic. The clothes that they wear, the setting of the city that they are in, not when they're on the front lines. So this is about Iris and Roman, who are two journalists working in a city, and there is a war between gods going on, and people are enlisting, and Iris goes to be a war correspondent on the front line, and Roman follows her. And she's not like, she thinks he's her main rival, and then as you come to find out, he's been harboring some feelings for her. And these were both such good books. I was very stressed out reading the second one because like at that point you're like, these are my babies and I don't want anything to happen to them. But I loved them. The magical typewriter aspect is very cool, that these typewriters are connected and you can send letters basically through the typewriter, which was very cool, very dark academic. I really do hope at some point these get made into a series because I think the set design, costume design, all of that would just be really amazing to see. So now here are my actual old favorites. Okay, let's do The Broken Girls by Simone St. James. The other day, my neighbor and I were talking. We just joined a book club and we're reading a thriller for the first one. And she asked me how I liked it, and I said it was good. It wasn't the best thriller I ever read, the one we're reading for this month. And she said she agreed. We talk a lot about thrillers. And then I tried to think what's the best thriller I ever read, and I think it's this book, The Broken Girls by Simone St. James, for like a true thriller. I really enjoyed this book. So this one has two timelines, the 1950s and like 2014, I think is when we are. Yeah, 2014. And Fiona Sheridan is a journalist in 2014. And her sister was murdered years earlier on the grounds of this campus of an old school called Idlewild Hall. And when there's a man in jail for the murder of her sister, but she doesn't really feel like she knows the whole story. And so she's kind of poking around the area in which her sister's body was found, and she finds a body that's like a skeleton from the 50s. And then you jump back in time to the girls who are going to school at that point, and you meet this group of friends, and you're reading this not sure which one of them is going to end up being the skeleton. And I loved this book. There's slight paranormal elements, not like overbearing, but slight paranormal elements. And the school setting is very good and creepy because it's like 1950s, and it's a school for like troubled girls. They're not like bad people, but they're like, you know what the 1950s would think of as a troubled girl. So I love this. I was actually thinking about maybe recommending this as the read for the next month for my book club because I wouldn't mind rereading it. And I very rarely reread thrillers. Next, I have The Cloisters by Katie Hayes. And if anyone ever said, was a book written specifically for you, I think it was this one written for me. So we follow Anne, who has grown up, I think, in Washington or Oregon. She's from the Pacific Northwest, and she's gotten a summer internship to work at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and she really wants to get out of her town. Her dad has recently died. Her mom's fallen apart. She doesn't really have any good friend connections either, so she's pretty, isolated personally, even before she gets to New York. She doesn't have people like checking in on her to make sure she's doing okay, which is good for the setup of this book. She shows up to her internship, and the person in charge is like, oh, actually the professor or whatever you were supposed to work under, like he went to Germany. We don't have a spot for you. And she's like, I rented an apartment in New York. I have no money. I don't have money to fly home. And when she's there kind of freaking out, this other man approaches her and says, like, I work at the Cloisters, which is a museum of medieval art in New York. It's like, I could use her. And they're kind of like, fine, whatever. So she goes to the Cloisters, and it ends up being like an interpersonal nightmare because the people who work there are so weird. But they are also trying to find the oldest tarot cards in existence. Now, if you've followed this channel for any period of time, or you've read my book, The Hedge Witch, you know that I love tarot cards, and I find the history of tarot cards very fascinating. So this was so much fun. This was called a gothic fiction, I think, but I would say it definitely has thriller vibes. Gothic fiction, I always feel like, is like a thriller with a slower pace, is the best way to describe it. And this one was great. I don't have a copy of this one, but I am going to quickly mention it, and it's The Maidens by Alex Michaelides. That is my favorite book by Alex Michaelides. He also wrote The Silent Patient. I would recommend The Maidens over The Silent Patient for Dark Academia because it's set in Oxford. It takes place at a university. Now I'm blanking. Is it set at Cambridge? It is set at either Oxford or Cambridge, and there's a murder of a student, and this woman who is there because her guardian, the child, I mean, she's not really a child anymore, she's in college, who she is the guardian of, is kind of like embroiled in all these issues. And she becomes convinced that one of the professors is the murderer, and you just kind of watch her personal investigation. And the vibes in that are immaculate. Okay, I'm going to throw you with kind of a loop of this one, but I do think The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab has a lot of Dark Academia vibes, mainly because of the art and literature aspect. This is about a woman who is gonna have to marry someone she doesn't want to marry, and she makes a deal with the devil to live forever, but no one will ever remember her. And it's a very sad, dark, and depressing book. So don't go into this if you are in a place where you're like feeling existential, because it's very existential. Her life is pretty horrible for a very long time until she learns how to live like this. But I do think as you follow her, there are snippets of her in history due to the fact that people don't remember her, but a lot of artists feel like they dreamed her. So she shows up in a lot of paintings. She's the subject of songs, and that felt very Dark Academia to me. Next, I have The New Life by Tom Crew. This is historical fiction about two men named John and Henry, and they are contemporaries of Oscar Wilde. They're not real people, but that's the time period we're set in. And it's about two men trying to write a paper to kind of prove that there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. So this book, there's a lot of like philosophical discussion and like morality discussions and research and scientific research for the time period. When I read this, it was interesting because you almost felt like you were reading a book that was written in the 1800s. Obviously it was not. There are like male sex scenes in here, so you're not reading a book that was written then. But the author did a wonderful job capturing sort of the tone of a classic of the time period in the writing. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a spoiler. It doesn't end terribly sad because I was worried that this was going to end with one or both of our main characters either like being thrown in prison or being killed, and it does not end that way. It doesn't end happily ever after, but it gives you an ending that doesn't like tear your soul out, which I feel like is important to let people know. Okay, we're gonna end with my three favorite of all time. The first being If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio, which I'm sure is a lot of people's favorite. I haven't read The Secret History. That's why this isn't on there. It's been on my TBR for years. And honestly, I was thinking today, like, when am I actually going to read that? And I feel like the answer is going to be when I do something crazy like give up BookTube, because it's going to be very time consuming to read it. Or when I decide 1 month I only want to read like 2 books or 3 books. If We Were Villains is about a small performing arts college and a group of kids there who are constantly learning and performing Shakespeare, which just seems so stressful. And one of them is murdered. And it is narrated by Oliver, who has just gotten out of jail, serving a 10-year sentence for the murder. And the investigating officer, who has since retired, picks him up and is like, will you tell me what actually happened now? And he does. And it's really good. I think I did hear that this is going to be a mini-series. I'll write whether or not that's true or not, because I will watch the heck out of it. Fantastic. Next, I have some questions for you by Rebecca Makkai. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I read it, I want to say March of 2023, I think is when I read this book, and I loved it. So we have two timelines. Bodhi is now a successful podcaster. She's divorced. She has 2 kids, and she has been invited back to her alma mater, which is a boarding school, to teach a class or 2 classes. And so she's teaching a film class, I think is the first one, but the more important one is a podcasting class. And so she gives the students the assignment that they have to come up with a podcast, but that the podcast has to have something to do with the school to kind of like narrow down the field. And one of the students asks if they can do the murder of Thalia. I think her last name is Kent. Let me double check. Keith. Thalia Keith. And Bodhi is a little hesitant because Thalia was her roommate the year before she was murdered, but decides to let the students do it. And then together, Bodhi and these students kind of realize that the person who is in jail for it really most likely didn't do it. And then you follow the investigation. And this is a lit fic, not a thriller. So go into it knowing that. And there are some interesting kind of like breakaways from the story. I'm trying to see if I can find one where you just have like a little short snippet that's kind of like about a true crime, like a girl or woman that was murdered by someone from like what you would think a true crime podcast sounded like. And I really liked that. So that's a really great dark academia murder at a school lit fic that you should all enjoy. And then lastly, I said earlier I was going to talk about Carol Goodman again. The Sea of Lost Girls by Carol Goodman. This is my favorite Carol Goodman. I've read every single one of her books with the exception of The Widow's House, which I'll probably read this year. And this one is phenomenal. Our main character in this is Tess, and she is a teacher at a boarding school. And she has a son who she had quite young, who is a student at the boarding school. And then she is married to a man who works at the boarding school. This is not her son Rudy's father. So the book opens and Tess's phone rings at like 2:33 in the morning. And her son Rudy is like, I need you to pick me up. And they have this rule that if he calls her and needs a ride home, she will come pick him up, no questions asked. She just wants him to get out of it, whatever bad situation. She picks him up, he's soaking wet and he's visibly upset, and she takes him home. The next morning, she finds out that Rudy's girlfriend was murdered in the middle of the night at some point. And she starts to wonder whether her son killed his girlfriend. And you get the school setting, but also you get this amazing, Carol Goodman's very good at like coming up with local folklore. Like she invents it and then having it weave through the story, which was so good. And this book is a winter, it's not a fall, it's a winter story. And like the dread and the ice and like trying to run when it's slippery and you can't see and it's freezing was so good in this book. This is definitely more of like a thriller mystery. I think Carol Goodman's books are technically classified as literary mysteries. It's so good. You should definitely read it. Those are all my dark academia books, which I hope you found a new one. I know I talked about some like favorites that most people have read. If We Were Villains, Addie LaRue, those are the Maidens. Those are some pretty tried and true ones, but I hope that there were a few in here that maybe you are interested in and might want to give a try. In the description, please tell me what your favorite dark academia book is of all time. And if you've made it this far and don't want to write words, but want to let me know you did, give me a big stack of books emoji, because all of us dark academia people are reading constantly. And as always, I hope you're in the middle of a good book, about to start reading a good book, or about to start writing a great book. I'll see you soon.